All right.
All right, welcome everybody. Hope you can hear me just fine. As the introduction said, we're going to talk a little bit about seeds today, and this is actually a presentation that I put together for a class at the North Carolina Arboretum. It was a 3-hour class, and we don't have 3 hours today, but Jerry Hardesty in the past has been very interested in the topic, and he kind of pushed me to give a presentation. So I've taken 3 hours of material and cut it down quite a bit, but hopefully it'll give you a kind of an overview and a little bit different way to think about seeds, which are obviously a very integral part of our gardening experience, but hopefully this will help get you to think about seeds a little bit differently. We do have some time at the end for kind of comments and questions, so if you could kind of hold your questions till then, and we'll use the chat function, and you can go ahead and use the chat box, and maybe Warren can relay those questions at the end. So I like to start with this because this is a picture, say, of a morning breakfast. Maybe it's in a restaurant or in your home. And what I want you to kind of think about, and what is really brought out in this book, is kind of the interrelationship between us and seed-producing plants. So if we really look at this picture, just think of all the things that come from seed-producing plants. And so in the background, we see chairs, which are made of wood, which obviously comes from a seed-producing plant. We have the seat covers and napkins and tablecloth that come from cotton, and we're going to talk about cotton a little bit more in a few minutes, which is a seed-producing plant. We have grapefruit juice and orange juice and coffee, all beverages that come from seed-producing plants. We have packets of sugar, which, whether it comes from sugar cane or sugar beets, are seed-producing plants. We have pepper. We have obviously wheat in the toast and the croissant. We have some fruits there, banana and other fruits. And even the meats that are shown there and cheese are going to come from food-producing animals that eat seed-producing plants. So one of the challenges I give to you is over the rest of the day, as you walk around your home, or maybe you travel outside, and as you eat your meals, kind of think about, what are all the things that I see in my home? What are the things that I'm eating that come from seed-producing plants? And that's one of the takeaways from today, is to kind of think about that concept. So I like this quote. It comes from Thor Hansen's book, but it's from George Bernard Shaw. Think of the fierce energy concentrated in an acorn. You bury it in the ground and it explodes into a giant oak. I've been doing a lot of hiking the last couple of weeks on the Mountain to Sea Trail and up in Bent Creek Experimental Forest. And this is a bumper year for acorns, if you haven't noticed already. And there were times on the trail where it was like I was on roller skates. There were so many acorns. And so it's a big acorn year, a big year for mast. And I think the squirrels and the bear and the other animals that rely on acorns are going to be pretty happy. So if we just look at plants in general that we know about here on Mother Earth, there are estimated to be over 350,000 seed-producing plants. We call those spermatophytes, and of course in Latin, sperm means seed and phyte means plant, and they constitute over 90% of all the known flora on Earth. And at least of the seed producers, we divide them into gymnosperms, which means naked seeds, and there's around 1,000 species. Most of them we're familiar with are conifers, the ginkgo tree, and cycads. But the vast majority are angiosperms, and that's primarily what we're going to focus on today, although we'll mention a couple of gymnosperms along the way. So the vast majority of plants are angiosperms, well over 350,000 of those. And seeds come in a variety of sizes and shapes, and kind of from the smallest to the largest. The smallest is a type of orchid where it takes 1 million seeds to make up 1 single gram. And the largest seed in the world is the Coco de Mer, which comes from the Maldive Islands. And that is 1 seed. You can see this young lad holding that weighs just one seed 20 kilograms. And so again, that variety shows you quite a bit of variety just in size and certainly in shape and function. So here's what I've based the presentation on. And if you enjoy some of the material that I present today, you may want to get this book and read it. It's called The Triumph of Seeds. So I've stolen the title by a scientist and botanist named Thor Hansen. And he divides the book into 5 sections. Seeds nourish, seeds unite, they endure, defend, and travel. And so what I'm going to give you is sort of a little bit of information about each of those 5 topics. And again, if it's something that you find of interest, I would encourage you to get the book. It's really a good read. And when it comes to seeds nourish, he talks not only about how seeds nourish the embryonic plant itself, but how seeds nourish us as a human species. So the first question is, what is a seed? And you might think about that. If I had you take a blank piece of paper and write down a definition, what would you write down as a definition for what is a seed? It's something as gardeners we use every day or all the time, but do we really kind of think about what is it? And so there's several definitions we could use. It's what a gardener or a farmer sows to raise a crop, and that's how many of us view a seed. It's the seed coat and what lies within, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. That's certainly one way to define it. It's the hard bit that encompasses a baby plant. That's kind of another way to think of it. And if we look up on Wikipedia, it's going to tell you that a seed is an embryonic plant that's enclosed in a protective outer covering. Well, in the book, Thor Hansen interviews extensively a woman named Carol Baskin. And Carol Baskin and her husband are both botanists and biologists at the University of Kentucky who studied seeds extensively. And I really like her definition. A seed is a baby plant in a box with its lunch. And so if we kind of look at a generic drawing of a seed, what we see is the baby is basically the embryo of the plant. The box is the seed coat that goes around the outside, and the lunch is the nutritive tissue or the food store that's inside the seed. And as we'll see, that lunch can be very large for some seeds, and it can be virtually non-existent for other seeds. But again, definition, it's a baby in a box with its lunch. So we're going to focus on the seed coat, and the seed coat can be anywhere from very thin to very thick. And here's some 3 examples of where the seed coat is very thin. And we're going to come back and talk about the avocado several times. But the avocado, of course, the fruit is around the seed, but that seed is just that really thin, slimy coat that's on the seed is the seed coat. And of course, with legumes and beans, it's very easy with fresh beans to go ahead and remove that seed coat, which is thin. And we've probably all eaten dried roasted peanuts. And of course, the seed coat is that thin, papery, usually kind of reddish material, reddish brown material that's around the peanut that we eat. And so the shell itself is what we call the pericarp. And we're going to look at the pericarp in more detail with, again, a fruit that we're all familiar with, and that's the peach. And so the pericarp is nothing more than the fruit wall that surrounds the seed. So if we've used the peach as an example, the pericarp is made up of the exocarp, of course, exo meaning outside, and that's the skin of the peach. The mesocarp, which is what we like to eat. The endocarp is what we call the pit, but it's really inside the pit or inside the endocarp is the seed itself. And so again, if we cut open a peach seed, we would find the endosperm, which is the lunch. We would find the embryo, and we would find a very thin seed coat. So even in this large fruit, the seed coat itself is fairly thin. And we can see that if we actually look at the peach itself, the exocarp has been removed, But we see the mesocarp, we see the endocarp, and then if we crack open what we call the pit, we'll find the seed inside that actually has a very thin seed coat. On the other hand, seed coats can be relatively thick, and we're all familiar with sunflower seeds, and again, shows sunflower seeds and then one that's germinating, and that thick shell is the seed coat. And so again, seed coats come in a variety of types and kinds. Here's an interesting seed coat, and this is the mistletoe plant. And if we think about the mistletoe, where do mistletoes live? They live in trees. They're basically a true parasitic plant. They basically establish their roots on the bark of trees, up on the limbs of trees, and penetrate that bark and get their moisture and nutrition from the tree. And they do produce fruit with seeds inside, so they are a seed producing plant. So the question is, well, how does a mistletoe stay in the tree? Why doesn't the fruit just fall off and fall to the ground, and that's the end of it? And the reason is because inside that fruit, you can see here the seed coat is actually a very sticky, tenacious material. So it's not that thin, hard coat that we think about, or a thick one. It's very sticky, and that really helps then for the distribution of the mistletoe within a tree. So this is a picture of the great kiskadee. It's a bird that we don't have here in North Carolina. It's found in primarily Mexico, Central America. It will wander up into southern Texas. And the great kiskadee loves mistletoe fruit, but you can see what it does. It basically likes to eat the fruit, but it doesn't like the seed and the sticky seed coat. And so after it eats the fruit, it just kind of throws that seed around on that sticky seed coat. And here you can see that then it sticks to the branch. And once it's stuck to the branch, that seed, under the right conditions, will go ahead and germinate. And you can see the small mistletoe starting to grow. And that's why the mistletoe can basically go from one branch to another tree. In Australia, there are over 90 different kinds of mistletoe, and there's actually a specific bird called the mistletoe bird, and it will eat all of these varieties, and it has a very altered gastrointestinal tract, and that once it eats the mistletoe fruit, it will actually move through its digestive tract in about 30 minutes. And you can actually go on YouTube and see pictures of this bird. It will actually then defecate out or poop out this seed with the sticky seed coat still on there. It's basically digested the fruit, and you can see on the YouTube video, it will basically go ahead and rub its rear end on a branch to get rid of that sticky thing that came out its cloacal vent, and that's how it spreads mistletoe from tree to tree. The seed coats can also have appendages, and we call those arils or the arillus, and you're all familiar with these, the wings on a maple tree. We're going to talk about cotton a little bit later, but the cotton fibers are basically a seed appendage. We're going to talk about kind of burrs and thistles again later. And we have actually one of our spices comes from a seed coat. So in the lower right, we have a nutmeg, and that orange-yellow material is actually a seed coat appendage of the nutmeg, and that's what we make into the spice called mace. We also have appendages that help with, again, sort of like the mistletoe, with distribution of seeds, and this is bloodroot, one of the spring ephemerals that is fairly common here in the mountains. And bloodroot seeds, you see the brown seed here with sort of a white gelatinous material, and this is called an elaiosome. And the elaiosome is very rich in both carbohydrates and protein. And the reason is that it attracts ants. And what ants will do is when this seed falls to the ground, they will harvest these seeds and take it back to their nest, and they will feed that elaiosome that's high in carbohydrates and protein to larval ants. And of course, you can see that the seed is much too large for the ant itself to really do anything with the seed. And so once that elaiosome has been consumed by the larva, the ant will either leave the seed there, or they will usually take it back out and go ahead and leave it in the soil. And so in that way, they distribute the seeds. And so if you find bloodroot, and this is true for Trillium, it's true for Spring Beauty and many of our spring ephemeral wildflowers, what you're going to find them is you're going to find a hillside, but right across the street or right across the trail or on the other side of the valley, you'll find none at all. And so when you see that hillside of bloodroot, just realize that they have been spread by ants. And so it's going to be a slow process, but that's the process tied to this elaiosome in the seed coat. So moving on to the food store, Carol Baskin also says that some babies have eaten all their lunch, some have eaten part of it, some have not taken a bite, and some have no lunch at all. And so we'll just show you a couple of examples of that. And this is a food that everyone's familiar with. This is the avocado, which is actually native to rainforests. And so it has, as I said, a very paper thin seed coat, but it has a large fruit around there. But this large seed, and everybody has seen an avocado seed, most of that seed is taken up with cotyledons. And of course, cotyledons are just embryonic leaves, or they're part of the embryo that functions similar to leaves. And in this case, the avocado has eaten its lunch. It's basically taken all the energy dense materials, primarily carbohydrates and starches, and incorporated it into these two huge cotyledons. So next time you consume an avocado, go ahead and take the seed and cut it in half, and you'll see that. And the reason for that is because avocados are native to the rainforest. They need a large dose of energy to sprout and get established in deep shade. They have to somehow be able to grow up to the point where they can get some sunlight. So they also rely on constant warmth and dampness in the environment, and they really don't need to survive drought, and they don't really need to survive cold temperatures. So basically, that large seed in the avocado is there to be able to allow that plant to germinate in a warm, dark, moist environment and have enough energy to be able to grow up and find sunlight. On the other hand, orchids pack no lunch at all. And so, as I said earlier, one of the orchids has the smallest seeds in the world. Around 1 million of them would only weigh a gram. And so most orchids produce very small seeds that have virtually no lunch nor nutritive material. And so how do they survive? Well, when they fall to the soil, what they have to do is that seed needs to establish a symbiotic relationship with a mycorrhizae, or symbiotic fungi, that lives in the soil. And so what you see down in the lower right is a picture of cells from inside an orchid seed. And what looks like a ball of twine or a mishmash of spaghetti are actually mycorrhizae hyphae. And so what happens is it's sort of like the Goldilocks story. If the mycorrhizae infect the cell, if mycorrhizae don't infect the cell, then the seed will go ahead and die because it has, or will not be able to germinate because it has no nutritive material virtually at all in the seed. However, if the mycorrhizae infects the seed and infects every one of the cells, the seed will go ahead and die too. But if it's just right, if some of the cells get infected by the mycorrhizae, it establishes a relationship where the mycorrhizae allows for nutrients to flow into the seed and enough nutrients to go ahead and to initiate the germination process. And then when that germination process has occurred and the orchid has grown, of course, that mature orchid will produce carbohydrates and sugars, and that's where the mycorrhizae will basically get its benefit from, being able to harvest some of the sugars that are made by the orchid when it's a mature plant. And so that's why for many, many years, nobody could figure out how to grow orchids, because they were trying to germinate orchid seeds in media or soil that didn't contain mycorrhizae. So that's a little bit about seeds and nourish. Next, we're going to talk about seeds unite. And we're going to talk about Gregor Mendel. And if you've ever taken a biology class in high school or a genetics class in college, you're probably familiar with him. He was an Augustinian friar and abbot. He lived and worked in Moravia, which is now part of the Czech Republic. And what he did is he actually, at the abbot where he was lived, he actually taught some science classes there, and he became very interested in growing plants and seeing the diversity of plants. And so the seed producing plant that he worked with was primarily the Austrian field pea, which is pictured here. And of course it would flower and then produce seeds. And so he learned to cross-pollinate different Australian field peas with different characteristics, and really did a very nice detailed study of that. And in 1866, published this paper titled The Experiments in Plant Hybridization. But because he was a religious figure, even though he was a teacher, religious figure, he was really not thought of as a scientist by others at the time. And really his studies went unread. It wasn't until the turn of the 20th century, around 1900, that several other scientists or botanists rediscovered his work, went ahead and repeated his studies and validated them. And we now know, and so it was really posthumously that he was recognized as the founder of modern genetics and really established the rules of heredity. And it really tells you why, if there's over 350,000 plants on the earth, why the vast majority of them are seed producing plants, because it allows for genetic mixing, which really gives great evolutionary potential for improvement in a species. And again, it just really further validates why seed producing plants are so ubiquitous. Seeds endure. So this is the Masada Fortress. It's found in the Judean desert in Israel. And there was fortified palaces were first built there, estimated around 30 or 35 BCE. And in 73 and 74 CE or AD, the Jewish folks who lived in the Masada fortress were laid siege by Roman troops, and this was part of the first Jewish-Roman wars. And basically, the Romans conquered the fortress. And when they overran the fortress, they found that most of the soldiers had killed themselves and had burned most of the buildings to the ground, except for sort of the kitchen and storage areas. But over years, these became completely covered over by dust and dirt. And in 1963, they were excavating the fortress, and in the area where the kitchens were, they found buried underneath tons and tons of soil a clay jar that contained date palm seeds. And so this was put in a museum and sat there for 40 years until a couple of botanists and horticulturalists discovered the seeds and thought, gosh, let's see if we can get these to germinate. And so they carbon dated the seeds, and they found that the seeds had a carbon dating of somewhere between 150 BC to somewhere around 60 AD. So that certainly fit right in the time of when this clay jar with the date palm seeds might have been buried. And these are the two ladies that in the early 2000s got one of the seeds to germinate. and they soaked the seeds in hot water, and then they soaked it in a kind of a nutrient solution made from seaweed that was high in nutrients and other factors. And they got this date palm to germinate. And they named it Methuselah. And it was so they were really the first ones to prove that you could literally germinate a plant from a seed that was 2,000 years old. They were hoping that it would be a female, and they might be able to cross it with a current date palm male pollen and produce dates, but it turned out to be a male. And so they needed a female plant, and over the next 10 years, there were some other date palm seeds that were found to be over 1,000 years old that were discovered in other sites. And it was just reported this spring or this past spring, I think it was February or March, that they have successfully taken pollen from this male Methuselah 2,000-year-old plant, and they germinated, or they used that then on some female date palms, and they produced date palms really from plants that are over 1,000 years old. So it certainly shows that many seeds can endure for a long period of time. So we're going to talk about seeds traveling or dispersal in a few minutes, but we also need to talk about dormancy. And certainly if we think about that Methuselah seed, it had lain dormant for 2,000 years. And by definition, the dormancy as it relates to seeds is a pause for any length of time after a seed matures and before it sprouts. And if you want to kind of think about it, it's dispersal through time. We know we can certainly, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, we can have seeds that disperse by many other mechanisms, but dormancy is literally dispersal through time. So here's a picture from Death Valley. I've just visited Death Valley one time many years ago, arrived there in February, literally in a driving rainstorm, and they got about half their annual rainfall in the 24 hours that I was there. But every 5 or 10 years, if there's an exceedingly high amount of moisture during the winter, in the spring, you'll have this blossoming of wildflowers that's just incredible. And I didn't see that, but I certainly was there during a rainstorm. And that's certainly trying to synchronize germination with optimal conditions. So if we look again, we looked at Methuselah, but there's been an ongoing and more recent study, kind of again looking at the effect of dormancy and the longevity of seeds. And that was done by a man named William James Beal. He was a botanist at Michigan State University, and in fact, the botanical garden on the Michigan State's campus is named after William Beal. And William Beal, while he was teaching botany, he got lots of questions from farmers because they were really having problems with weeds in their farm fields, and they really wanted to know what they could do to really attack the weed problem. And one of the things that Beal wanted to find out is how long could weed seeds actually persist in a farmer's field. And so he started an experiment that is ongoing to this day, and it's called Beal bottles, or Beal's bottles. He took 20 glass bottles, and in each of those bottles, he put some moist sand. He put in 50 seeds in each bottle from 21 different species of plants that were typically causing weed problems in the farmer's fields. And he started this experiment in 1879, and he buried the bottles in an unknown location on campus. And every 5 years, he would take one of the bottles, and he would take some seeds out of the bottles, and he would go ahead and plant those and see what kind of germination rate he got. Well, this experiment continued up into the 1920s when he passed away, and other faculty members at Michigan State continued his work. And in fact, it is ongoing, and it is expected that now they're just trying to plant seeds every 20 years. And so they think they have enough bottles and enough seeds for this experiment to go to the year 2100. Well, in the year 2000, They retrieved, I think, about 10 or 12 seeds from one of the remaining bottles, and 2 grew. And so here see common or dwarf mallow and moth mullein. Both of those grew in the year 2000. So those were coming from seeds that Beale had put in the bottles 121 years previously. The year 2020, this spring, they were supposed to retrieve more seeds and plant them. And I've been doing internet searches and trying to find out if results from the seeds that were supposedly planted this year, if any of those germinated, and I haven't been able to find any information, but I look forward to seeing if there'll be a report that comes out about whether any weed seeds from his bottles germinated, which would have been, again, about 140 years. Now, not all seeds endure for 2,000 years or for 120 years. So there are a number of seeds, and we already talked about one, the avocado, that are called recalcitrant seeds, and sometimes they're called unorthodox seeds. And basically that means that they're desiccation sensitive, so they cannot survive for longer than a few days to a few weeks to a few months, that once they dry out, the embryo dies. So we have this idea that seeds can endure for long periods of time, but there are many seeds that, because of the environment where the plant grows, they wouldn't survive. And so again, an example would be the avocado. It's in a very warm, damp, moist environment where rot can happen very quickly. And so again, it's an example of a seed that once it dries out, the embryo dies. Cocoa, cacao, mango, wild rice, the seed from wild rice, which of course is an aquatic grass, and sugar maple. And so that sugar maple seed, the normal sugar maple location is usually along stream sides or in a moist area, but once that sugar maple seed dries out and becomes brown, the embryo is dead, and you're not going to get that seed to germinate. So I think it's important to remember that we've talked about seeds endure, and that's why I said seeds endure sometimes, but there are what are called recalcitrant seeds that cannot be stored or kept for long periods of time. Seeds defend. So this is a painting or a drawing of Christopher Columbus when he came to the shores of the Caribbean. And of course, he was looking for this. He was looking for the route to India to be able to get spices, nutmeg and black peppercorn and cloves and other spices. And unbeknownst to him, when he landed here, he certainly didn't find those spices. But what he did find were these, which were peppers. And in the long run, peppers probably have more of an economic impact, and not only an economic impact, but a gastronomic impact in human beings, and even the spices that Columbus was looking for. And of course, peppers are native to Mesoamerica, so that's Central America, Mexico, northern part of South America, the Caribbean, similar to tomatoes. So tomatoes have sort of the same heritage. And so these peppers very quickly made their way, both by Columbus and Spanish explorers, but Portuguese explorers back to Europe, and of course from there spread around the world. So this is Noelle McNickey. This shows her when she was working on her PhD dissertation. She was doing it at Washington State University. And the title of her dissertation was How the Chili Got Its Spice: Ecological and Evolutionary Interactions Between Fungal Fruit Pathogens and Wild Chilies. And what she was looking at is there was a variety of a wild chili in southern Mexico that people said that the hotness or how spicy or hot it was to the human palate varied tremendously depending on where the plant or the chili pepper was planted. And so what she did is she took this wild variety of pepper and she planted it in many different locations that had different weather extremes. So she planted it in places that were warm and humid, and because of that had very high disease um, uh, attack on the plant. And then she took the same pepper plants and she planted them in dry, arid, different climate. And what she found is, and of course we know that the hot factor, if you will, is located in the seeds and in the membranes around the seeds. And so what she found is those pepper plants that were planted in the warm, humid areas were much higher in capsaicin. And of course, capsaicin is the compound that gives heat to most of the peppers. And she found the capsaicin levels in the seeds and in the membranes around the seeds was much, much higher. And that's because capsaicin actually has antifungal properties. And so again, these plants that were put in an environment where they had a lot of pathogen pressure, if you will, high amounts of fungal pathogens that could potentially attack the peppers, those peppers were much higher in capsaicin versus the exact same plants that were put in a more arid environment where there was much less fungal pathogen pressure. So again, showing that what we like about the pepper, or many of us like about the heat factor, is actually there in the plant because of its antifungal properties. And of course, we use that. Some of us do, and that birds cannot really taste capsaicin, whereas mammals can, and so we can use hot pepper as a repellent in bird foods and other products. So this is the Sayaka tanager. It's native to South America, primarily Brazil and the surrounding countries, and the Malagueta pepper. And the Malagueta pepper is probably the most widely used chili pepper in Brazil. And the Portuguese, of course, were the first Europeans to kind of discover and explore Brazil, and they took the Malagueta pepper back to Europe and again used it as a black pepper substitute. And the Sayaka tanager, again, loves these fruits. Birds are completely oblivious to the effects of capsaicin, and these are quite high in capsaicin, but it eats the fruits and then obviously flies to a different place, and the seeds come out the other end, and it's the primary way that this particular pepper is spread in the wild. And then finally, caffeine. And we're all familiar with caffeine, and many of it like it as a way to get started in the morning. And so we find caffeine in coffee, we find it in cocoa, cacao, we find it in guarnera, another nut, we find it in the cola nuts. So what eventually became Coca-Cola or cola drinks, and it's certainly found in tea as well. And so we like caffeine that we go ahead and get from drinks or foods that are made from these products, but what is its purpose in the plant? Well, what they found is that caffeine is very highly concentrated, not only in the nuts or fruits, but in the leaves of young seedlings. And so if we take this young coffee seedling, what they found is that just like it can kind of give us the jitters or give us a good positive jolt in the morning, it will adversely affect the nervous system of other animals. And so things like snails and slugs, if they start feeding on the young coffee seedling, will develop neurological sensitivity. And same thing with many of the pathogen insects as well. So what we use a plant seed for as a stimulant is actually there as a natural compound in the plant to prevent its destruction by pests. And finally, seeds travel. So seeds travel, there's two terms. There's auditory, which means there are no external factors that affect the distribution of the seed. But we're really going to focus today on allochory, and allochory just means These are different external mechanisms that the plant uses to have their seeds dispersed. And for allochory, there's 5 basic mechanisms: gravity, wind, water, animals, and what we call ballistics. And we're going to show you some examples of each of those. So barochory is dispersal by gravity. And we'll talk about fruits here in a few minutes, but obviously fruits being ingested by an animal are one way to move seeds around. But if we think of apples, apples are actually thought to be native to Central Asia, and in the areas where they thought the apples derived, it was primarily on hilly areas in Central Asia. And so not only was it an animal eating the fruit and dispersing the seeds, is that on the hills, when the apple fell from the tree, it would roll down the hill and was one dispersal method for the original apples. The nemachory, dispersal by wind, and we're all familiar with that, with milkweed and with dandelion. But here's a really unique seed that has wind dispersal. It's called the Javan cucumber, and obviously then it's native to the Java in Indonesia. And I love its species name. It's Macrocarpa, of course, meaning large seed. And you can see here how large the seed is, and look at the seed appendages are just create a beautifully aerodynamic seed with its seed coat. And in fact, under high wind conditions, when these seed pods will break open, these can literally travel miles and miles before they settle. And in fact, it looks very much like we know today to be a swept wing aircraft. And so aerodynamically, it was kind of creates a swept wing type of shape that goes very far aerodynamically, long before we adopted it for human flight. Cotton is probably thought to be one of the oldest cultivated crops. There's evidence of cultivation 4,000 and 5,000 years ago, what we know as upland cotton. And of course, cotton, what we use it for, is separated from the seed. And each cotton seed can have up to 20,000 fibers. And of course, this allows then the seeds to be dispersed by 2 methods, either by air or by water. And in fact, one scientist published a paper now about 60 years ago that looked at the potential for cotton seeds to be distributed long range over the ocean. And so both air and water can be methods for a natural cotton dispersal. Ballachory is dispersal by forceful seed ejection. And 2 that are sort of interesting, both have a common name that ends in cucumber, the squirting cucumber and the exploding cucumber. And this shows both of the seed pods. And the squirting cucumber, once it's mature and is stimulated mechanically, it will literally squirt out under pressure the seeds. And the exploding cucumber we see here, the seeds are in the pod under tension, and when they're touched, they'll explode. And this can actually shoot the seeds literally 10, 15, 20 feet away. And I don't have time to show you the movie, but I would encourage you, if you go to YouTube, just plug in Earth Unplugged. It's a couple of young men that do slow motion photography of various natural forces. And if you just put in Earth Unplugged slow-mo number 36, they have some really wonderful slow motion videos of the squirting and exploding cucumber and what they look like. And of course, right now, what you're going to find here is jewelweed, and jewelweed has just over the last couple of weeks gone to seed. Of course, there's 2 forms of jewelweed here in the mountains: the pale or yellow jewelweed and the orange jewelweed, and they both like to have wet feet, so you're going to find them in wet conditions. And just love their names: the Touch Me Not, Quick in the Hand, Snapweed, Kicking Bolt, Colt, or Jack, Jump Up and Kiss Me. And very similar to the exploding cucumber, what you're going to find now are these seed pods. Once they've matured, if you just touch them, they literally explode, and they can throw the seeds anywhere from 3 to 9 feet away from jewelweed. And love to find these and cause these to explode with my grandkids. They love to find those. And right about now, you're going to find the jewelweed pods that you can go and touch and watch them forcefully eject their seeds. Hydrochory, dispersal by water. Again, lotus coconuts are a good example of that. Zoochory is dispersal by animals. This is the Douglas squirrel, and he is found only in those areas where Douglas fir are found, which of course is a conifer that grows in the western United States. And it will go ahead and eat the seeds, or eat the pine cones and eat the seeds, and then it'll also allow them to accumulate at the bottom of the tree. They call that a midden. And this serves as not only a place where they will go ahead and spend the winter when the snow gets really deep, but it serves as a food source for themselves and for lots of other animals. And so they found that mice and voles and shrews and chipmunks will feed on these Douglas fir seeds. They're very high in lipids, almost 60% fat, so they're very high in energy. So not only is it a food source for the squirrel, it's a food source for voles, moles, shrews, and chipmunks, and they will also go ahead and distribute those seeds and bury those out in the forest. So kind of a very strategic way for the Douglas fir to disperse its seeds. Also in the Southwest, you'll find the acorn woodpecker, a picture of them here that actually harvest the acorns and will drill holes in the tree and dispose of those, and obviously then those will help spread the oaks. And we already saw this called myrmecochory, dispersal by ants. And again, there are a number of plants that are dispersed by ants. I think of 300 or 400 worldwide. And again, in our area, probably the spring ephemerals, bloodroot, spring beauty, and trillium are all dispersed by myrmecochory. Epizoochory. So epi means zoochory, of course, dispersal by animals. Epi meaning outside, and we're all familiar with things like this, which will become attached to the fur of animals, and so they're dispersed from the outside of animals. And things like beggar ticks or stick tights or whatever name we have for them just shows that we serve that function as well. Endozoochory is dispersal from inside of animals. I had the opportunity to visit the Galapagos Islands about 10 years ago. And the unique thing about the Galapagos is there are no native mammalian species. It's all reptiles. It's like visiting the age of the dinosaurs. And so the animals that are primarily at the top of the food chain, if you will, are reptiles. Like this is a picture I took of the land iguana and one of the Galapagos tortoise. And so they find that many of the fruiting and many of the seeds that are in fruits on the Galapagos Islands, for them to germinate, they must pass through the digestive tract of either the land iguana or the Galapagos tortoise. And so that's important for, that's actually one of the ways that enhances the germination of the seeds. And the seed is much more likely to germinate if it's passed through one of these reptiles than if it hasn't. So I found this story, or study, that was done about 8 years ago, or published about 8 years ago, that I thought was sort of interesting after visiting there, seed dispersal by the Galapagos tortoise. And so these botanists and biologists examined dung piles from the Galapagos tortoise. And what they found is that there were over 45 different plant species seeds that were identified in the dung piles, almost 500 intact seeds in each pile. Usually they would stay, or it would take them about 12 days to pass through the tortoise. And so that gave the tortoise, even though he was slow moving, a way to really disperse widely. And so they would, on average, travel about 1,000 feet before they created the dung pile. And again, one of the key ways that seeds are spread around the islands. And in our own backyard, we have this creature, which is the eastern box turtle. Eastern box turtle is the official state reptile of North Carolina and Tennessee, and it loves May apples. And here we see a May apple in fruit, usually in May or June, and it's right at the right height that the turtle will go ahead and eat it. Again, we'll pass that seed through it as it wanders along and helps to spread May apples. And finally, fruits, and we're all familiar with fruits, and the book really talks quite a bit, and I won't go into any more detail about the concept of affordability and what a plant has to do to expend nutrients and energy and development of a fruit. And of course, it spends all that energy and other nutrients to develop a fruit, so that hopefully that will improve the dispersal and ultimately the germination and growth of that plant. And so endozoochory via fruit, we saw good examples of how that can happen with reptiles, but we also know obviously that it happens with birds and mammals of all sizes, from bats to bears. And so this endozoochory by fruit, really it's a really strong correlation between the plant and what might consume it. And so it really relates to the dietary habits of the animals, its migration patterns, and really the timing of reproduction. And one study looked at black bears, which obviously when blackberries and other fruit are available, that makes up a huge part of their diet. And they found that when black bears were in the fall or in the late summer, were eating blackberries, that they were passing about 500,000 seeds per day in their feces. And so it's one of the big reasons that the native blackberries, those thickets seem to be everywhere. And the final thing we're going to talk about is anthropochory, which is dispersal by human beings. And I found this story fascinating. This was an article that appeared in the New York Times about 5 or 6 years ago about this woman who is not only a botanist, but is a sociologist. And the article that I read, her name is Maria Teresa Alves. And the article I read was called Seeds of Change, New York, a Botany of Colonization. And what Ms. Dr. Alves has done is really looked at plants, primarily weeds, that are found around large ports where there was lots of commercial activity, not only today, but going back hundreds of years. So she has looked at weeds and plants that occur around the ports, and this one happened to be a study was about New York, but she's looked at Marseille, she's looked at a port, Reposari in Finland, Liverpool, Exeter, and Bristol in the UK, and Dunkirk, also in France. And so she tried to tie back the plants that she has found there, which many of them are non-native, and tried to trace that back to how they became located at that port. And of course, if we go back several hundred years to sailing ships, they all had ballast of some kind. And usually that ballast was rocks or boulders. Sometimes it was sand and soil, or those rocks would carry soil. And so when a ship would get to a port, it would oftentimes unload its ballast and leave it on the side of the shore in the port. And they would then maybe reintroduce the ballast later when they knew what goods they were going to be carrying. And what she's been able to do in all these studies is study what she calls ballast flora. And so you can kind of see in the background, one of the diagrams here is that she's found all these plants that are non-native to, say, in this case, New York, and she's traced them back to where they came from. And by doing that, you can literally look at patterns of colonization, patterns of slavery, the slave trade. You can actually trace the slave trade by the kind of weeds and plants that occur around these ports, and also gives you a hint to areas of global commerce. So again, this was something I wasn't familiar with, but I thought it was just fascinating. And again, just shows you that we help seeds travel in lots of different ways. So that's it. I hope I've given you a kind of a quick overview. I just kind of given you a little snippets of kind of the 5 different sections of his books. Seeds nourish, seeds unite, seeds endure, they defend, and they travel. And if you kind of find this interesting, I would encourage you to get the book and read it. A lot more details about each of these 5 areas than I've covered today. And thanks for listening, and really be open to not only your comments, but your questions. And I'll kind of leave it here. Henry David Thoreau, I have great faith in a seed. Convince me that you have a seed there, and I am prepared to expect wonders. So I'm going to stop there, and be happy to try to answer any questions.